If you have a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn it to Luke chapter 1. This is where we'll be spending our time. Zechariah, who has had his whole life turned upside down, he and Elizabeth, by the fact that John has come. They wanted a child, and now they've had this child. And, of course, Zechariah has been unable to speak. Man, I didn't get any cookies. Where are mine? That's okay. Zechariah has been unable to speak. I really, that's cool. Thanks. No, thank you. Zechariah has been unable to speak until this child was born. And when he gets the chance to speak, he breaks into a prophecy. And this prophecy is interesting, and we're going to unpack it a bit today because of the things that he says and the way in which they fit into the Jewish understandings here. All of these understandings are deeply Jewish. And so I think it's helpful for us as we look at things like this in the New Testament to have some grip of just the Jewish nature of what these things are. Then the things that we're to learn from them will make more sense. Let's take a look at the text. I'll begin reading in verse 67. John's father, Zechariah, was filled with the Holy Spirit and prophesied and said, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, because he's come and he's redeemed his people. He has raised up a horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David, just as he said through his prophets long ago. Salvation from our enemies and from the hand of all of those around us who hate us, to show mercy to our fathers, and to remember his holy covenant with us. The oath he swore to our father Abraham to rescue us from the hand of our enemies and to enable us to serve him without fear, in holiness and righteousness before God all of our days. And to you, my child, you will be called the prophet of the Most High. You will go before our Lord to prepare the way for him, to give his people the knowledge of your salvation, through the forgiveness of their sins because of the tender mercy of our God, by which the rising sun will come to us from heaven, to shine on those living in darkness, in the shadow of death, to guide our feet in the paths of peace." And the child John grew and became strong in the Spirit and lived in the deserts until he appeared publicly to all of Israel. A lot of imagery here. Old Testament imagery. Again, I can't stress this enough, or maybe I can stress it to the point that everybody doesn't want it stressed any further, but that'll be my problem. But when we read the Gospels, we are not reading, strictly speaking, New Testament documents. These documents are absolutely linked to the Old Testament. What makes them New Testament in our Bibles is the fact that Jesus comes and there's this change that comes into Judaism because of his death and resurrection. But technically speaking, these people are living in an Old Testament mindset. This text, as Zechariah gives this prophecy, quotes from Malachi chapter 4. So if you want to understand who John the Baptist was to be, he's fulfilling a prophecy from the Old Testament, which is quoted here. He's going to be the forerunner of the Messiah. That's who he's going to be. And Zechariah is given this information about John in a supernatural moment. This is not something that Zechariah could have known, except that God told him who this boy is going to be. I want to pause for a minute and let's all put our thinking hats on. Put yourself as a parent in the place of Zechariah for just a moment. And you have had this child that you really wanted, and you're past the age, you can't have him anymore, but you really wanted a child. God has given you this gift, you have this child, and now you're getting information about who this child's going to be. I have a friend, think on that for just a moment and listen to this story. I have a friend in Pennsylvania. He had a son. They had two sons that were born to them, and then there was a 10-year gap, and they thought, we were of age, we would like to have another child. They were in their late 30s, but the doctor said, if you would like to have another baby, go after it. So they did, and they had this child named Nate. Nate grew up, great kid, did well in school, everything about him. He signed up to go to college, went to a college. A year and a half into his college career, he comes home for a weekend, and he announces to his parents that he feels called by God to be a missionary. Now, we're sitting here this morning and we're thinking, oh, isn't that wonderful? I guarantee you that for a parent, there's a lot of mixed feeling that goes along with that. Zechariah is hearing of his son directly from God as to who this child's going to be, the forerunner for the Messiah. What does that mean? Doesn't know. I wonder what Zechariah and Elizabeth thought. We don't get any information about that. When John goes out and lives in the desert and eats locusts and wears animal skins, like this strange person that he becomes. What did they think of that? How did that register for them? I don't think we capture in our minds when we read about these people just what that would be for us. If a child of ours gets to a certain age and suddenly comes home and says, I'm going to China as a missionary, I feel called to do that. What would we say? We think about our children and we think about them in ways. I do. I mean, I got a kid that's in school right now. How do I think about him? I want to see him do well. And I want to see his life count for something. But if he came home and said, Dad, I feel called to be a missionary to the Sudan, what would I think? So we need to remember things like that. The Jews had an expectation here. This prophecy is not without its historical substantiation. They had an expectation that somebody would come in the power and the spirit of Elijah and would preempt the coming of the Messiah in some way, as the text says, to make the path for the Messiah straight and level. And in this prophecy, we've got a kind of a revelation just regarding life. The Jews have an expectation of deliverance, but the deliverance that actually comes is going to be very, very, very counterintuitive for them. That speaks to us so powerfully, does it not? Become a Christian and all your problems are solved. No. Become a Christian because you want to commit to following Jesus, and there'll be some new problems that you have to and I have to deal with. There'll be new problems. Some of them more difficult than the ones you had before. Because now, all of a sudden, I'm aware of what sin looks like in my own life. And it seems like, I don't know how it is for you, but the older I get, the more things I see in my own life that are sinful. That doesn't feel good. I mean, that's not fun. But it just goes on. Zechariah in prophecy, he prophesies as much about Jesus as he does about John. That's very significant as well. Well, this prophecy is broken into some segments. So I want to take it and make it present for us through the Jewish eyes that this prophecy has. He talks about salvation for the Jews. It's not only for the Jews, it's for the whole world. It's for everybody. And this aspect of salvation and deliverance, the word salvation and deliverance in the Old Testament can be almost interchanged. They really mean about the same thing. But he talks about it in a way that for a Jewish mind would be an utter mystery. He says things like the horn. When you read stuff like that in the Bible, what do you think? I mean, I look at it and I say, the horn, I don't even understand what that means. I mean, I know what a horn is. You got a horn on a car, and you got a horn on a bull, and you got a horn in an orchestra. But what's the horn here? It's speaking of power. It's going back to this picture because he links it with the throne of David. Who was David? David was the warrior king. A military picture of conquering, driving people out. That's the picture that they have. Defeat for the enemies, as Zechariah says. What does that mean? They're expecting that military leader. They're expecting somebody to come, throw the Roman yoke off, set up Jerusalem once again as the navel of the whole world. If anybody wants to know what God thinks, look toward Jerusalem and you'll know. I wonder what they thought when 75 years after John is born, the temple is torn down to the ground and everything burned and it's utterly destroyed. How does that work? How does that fit this prophecy? There's a lot in this that they just don't expect. Their expectation of freedom to practice Judaism, as he says here, he says, freedom to worship you. Well, they have that already in the Roman Empire. There are no impediments to their worship. They can do what they want as Jews. As a matter of fact, He says, and the people, freedom from those who hate us. All right, here we sit today. We know what military service is. We've got a veteran in the room. All right? The Jewish children, let's say you're a Greek and you live near Palestine and you've got a boy and he's the same age, say, as John, and he grows up. Your expectation, because you are in the Roman Empire, is your son will absolutely have to serve in the military for a set length of time. Doesn't have to stay there, but your son will serve in the military if you're anybody but a Jew. They're exempt. The Roman Empire does not require of their children that they serve in the military. The people hate us. Why? Well, if I'm a Greek dad and my son's going off to war in Carthage or in Britain with the Roman army, and the Jewish boy that grew up with my son playing in Palestine doesn't have to go just because he's Jewish, I'm going to feel that. The Jews felt that as well. That's why they wanted everything to be brought under the umbrella of Judaism as they expected it to be, so that these tensions would go away. No more tension in living. Shalom, that sense of peace that goes way beyond just an absence from conflict. The knowledge of salvation, what's that going to mean? It's going to mean way more than Zechariah knows it's going to mean. Because they're going to have, as the text says, an accurate knowledge of God. Well, that may not mean anything to us. But for the Jew, it meant a lot. You know why? You could go in any synagogue and you could go in the temple, and there's one thing you will not find in any synagogue or in the temple. One thing that absolutely will not be there, and that is an image. There is no image of God in the temple or in any synagogue, because that was anathema to them. That was to set up an idol for them. That's why they got in so much trouble at the bottom of the mountain when they fashioned the golden calves. These golden calves just jumped out of the fire. We don't know how that happened, but here they are. And they got in trouble for that. Why? Because there was an image. God has no image in the Jewish mindset at all. So for them, Jesus comes and they do not understand it. Remember Philip? He says, Jesus, if you'll just show us the Father, that'll be enough for us. And what does Jesus say? Philip, I've been with you this long already and you don't know me? If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. The fullest representation of who God is, Jesus is. They don't understand any of that when Zechariah has this prophecy. He's a Jew. For him, an image is terrible. Then you've got forgiveness, which is spoken of here. The forgiveness is something, again, from the Jewish mindset. They cannot capture this in their minds. For them, forgiveness was Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Once a year, the high priest goes into the temple, goes into the main sanctuary, but then puts the bell on, puts the rope on his ankle, and takes a sacrifice in to the Holy of Holies where God is. That was the Jewish mind. You see, that's why the temple was so important. That Holy of Holies is where God is. We're going to walk right into God's presence here. And then we're going to have this sacrifice, Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, and He's going to give us forgiveness for our sins. And we're going to be set free from it once a year. They didn't understand Jesus' Messiahship at all. They didn't see Jesus as somebody, a Messiah who would come and die for the sins of the nation, die for the sins of the world, and then be resurrected. They don't have any clue about that. And yet, the payment of debt, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, where we make it clean for another year, Jesus comes and pays the debt for the entirety of the human race. All those who were before, all those who are living when He comes, and all who will yet live, the debt was paid if we're willing to take it, to take the payment. The consequences for sin remain, but now we're right in front of God. That's totally foreign. Because you see, for the Jewish mind, living before God was a ladder that you climbed. You did these things, you did these things, you did these things, and then you were right before God, or more right than you were before you did those things. And the scales are being tipped all the time. You know, we're drifting back into in this scalar understanding of how close we are to God. And hopefully when we die, the good part's up here and the bad part's down here. And so we climb the ladder our whole life trying to make ourselves clean. That is not the salvation that Jesus was going to bring. And Zechariah and the Jews at the time did not understand this. What does it mean? It means that there's a different way in which the reckoning comes to us. In the Jewish mindset, there's no such thing as inner peace. A person who's Jewish at this time in history, they don't have a clue about what it is to feel that sense of rightness before God. They can't feel that. That's why Yom Kippur keeps happening. That's why we keep buying the doves and the lambs and everything else that we bring to the temple on these sacrifice days, the morning and the evening sacrifice. Every day, twice a day, we're doing this. We're climbing the ladder. What Jesus provides is something far greater. He's giving you and me that sense of inward peace. We don't have to climb a ladder anymore. That's not the way the Jews understood it. This coming change of interaction between God and His people is something so foreign to them, they don't at all have a mental matrix to plug this into. Here's why. Now, today, we live in a culture wherein if you talk to somebody who doesn't believe the gospel, what do they think? I can't tell you how many friends I've had who weren't believers who look at the gospel this way. They say to themselves, what's the angle? What's the angle here? Well, for some people, that angle is you just want my money. You're going to exercise some kind of power over me that I'm going to have to give you my money. That's an angle. People resent that angle. And that is one of the resistances we have to God. That there's this angle, this sense of, that even in the New Testament, with all of the glorified hindsight we have of what God has done in Jesus, that people still look at it and say, what's the angle? What kind of thing are you going to hold over me now because of this? And they look at God that way too. Let me just give you a perspective on this. Bill and Melinda Gates, everybody knows who the Gates are, right? I think still the richest human on the earth. Maybe that's changed, I don't know, but it doesn't matter. When you get to that level, who cares? A few billion one way or the other doesn't make much difference. They have given away billions of dollars to make the earth a better place for people who are, on the fringes of life at all, in places where people live on the fringes of life. One of those places is for the Dalit in India. You may not know who the Dalit are. That's a caste system in India. You have the caste system, and everybody, you got the Brahmins on top, and at the very bottom you have what are called the untouchables, the Dalit. If a Dalit person who is classified that way is on the sidewalk dying, and you're in the middle of your caste someplace else, you're not a Dalit, and you see them dying, you don't have to have any concern for them at all. You know why? That's just their karma working out. Too bad. Sorry about that. Wish it weren't so, but hey, things will be better maybe in the next life for you. And so they let them die on the sidewalk with no concern over them whatsoever. The Gates have poured billions of dollars toward helping these people who are dying of diseases that are easily preventable. Easily. A vaccination at 14 months old and you're never going to have that disease. That vaccination costs 30 cents. They're providing that. Well, a journalist in India got hold of the fact that the Gates were doing this, and guess what the journalist's reaction was? What's the angle? What's in it for Bill and Melinda here? Aren't they trying to exert some kind of power over us here in India? We don't like the fact that they're messing with karma here. People look at us in the church and they say, what's the angle? And I'm going to say, I'm sorry to say, they're not altogether unjustified in looking at us that way. And you turn on Christian TV and you see, it doesn't, you can Google anybody nowadays and you can find out a whole lot about them. Well, you take some of the televangelists and you Google their lives and you see the palaces that they live in. And people look at us and they look at a little church like this one and they say, what's the angle? Where is it you're trying to exert some kind of power over me? Wouldn't it be better if the journalist who wrote toward the Dalit would say thank you to Bill and Melinda instead of wondering what the angle is? Yeah. Christopher Hitchens was very critical of Teresa of Calcutta. You know why? I always wondered this. I knew that for a decade I've known it. But I thought, why? What has little old Teresa done, Mother Teresa, what has she done that made him so angry? You know what it was? I just discovered it this week. He was angry because she wasn't just ministering to the Dalit who were dying on the streets in Calcutta and providing comfort and care for them in their dying days. That's all she was doing. That's all her ministry has ever done. Why was he angry? Because she was also giving them the gospel. Not because he hated the gospel, but because he saw it as, why can't you just minister to them without that? Why do you have to? What's the angle? What's the angle? What's in it for you? This is the way people look at us. This is the way people look at the gospel. There is something in Zechariah's prophecy here that rubs humanity the wrong way. What is it? God has really spoken to the Jewish people. Salvation is of the Jews. People don't like that. They want to say, well, what about me? I'm not a Jewish person. And they don't like the particularism that God has spoken to a people. We forget, don't we? Some do, that Jesus was Jewish all the way. He was Jewish. So where does that flow into us? I'm going to tell you, it flows into us, it should, in the gratitude that we have, that we've at least been saved. Right? God doesn't owe us anything. He owes no human being on this planet, the Jews included, anything. But he has given us life. And in giving us life, and in making human beings and giving them to live, he gave us some of his image. And in that image, we can choose things. We're totally free to choose. I can choose to pick this tissue up. I can choose to release it. I can move it over here. I can choose all kinds of things. That's part of the image of God within us. But we can also choose to have some gratitude with regard to the grace that's been given us. You know, grace is a totally unique concept in all of the world religions. Did you know that? There is no world religion, you name it, and I'll explain to you how it's not. There is no world religion that offers grace. That is, come to God, ask for mercy, and he says, come on in. But there's a way that that's done. That's part of what people don't like either, that there's just one way. Jesus said, I'm the way. You're not coming to the Father anyplace else, any other way. God didn't give us 5 ways, he didn't give us 10. If he'd have given us 20, we'd have wanted 21. So it's not like God hasn't been gracious to us. He has. And the way is so simple. The way is so simple. I'm going to say that just like the beggar, remember the beggar? He's blind. John chapter 9. And Jesus heals his blindness. And the beggar says, I used to be blind, but now I can see. People all over the world are looking for they know not what. I'm convinced of it. Nobody knows what it is they're looking for. There's an itch that they just cannot scratch. And yet they want it scratched. And we express that desire to have that itch scratched by all kinds of things. Money, acquisition of things, pleasures. We busy ourselves. We make our lives as noisy and busy as possible trying to scratch the itch. And you know, if I make a life busy and filled with things enough, my whole lifetime can pass me by and I'll never really scratch the itch. Never scratch the itch. Those temporary things will fill all that stuff up, and Jesus will come and go, and we won't want him because we're not even aware of what it is we're asking for. And then a person can live their whole life like that, and look at the lunacy of this. Come to a place in their life just like Mr. George, just like my mom, Becky's mom, where David is right now, where all of us will be if Jesus doesn't return, and commit themselves to the great perhaps, because we're all going to die. Oh man. But Jesus, he comes into us, offers us that salvation. As Zechariah spoke, he offers it to us in a way that doesn't lift us out of this circumstance of living where we are. But he gives us a way to live in this circumstance filled with the peace of knowing that this life will pass by and this life means something, because ultimately I'm going to spend the rest of eternity with him in a place where I'd really like to be. That's valuable. What is it to say to you and me? We've all been to funerals. What is it to say? Or to be able to say, I should say it that way. We come to the person. We love them. They're gone. The corpse is there. You and I have the privilege of coming to them. If we've come the way that Jesus has provided, that God has provided in Jesus, if we come that way, we don't have to climb a ladder anymore, and we can walk up to that coffin and say, not goodbye. We could say, good night, I'll see you in the morning. I don't think you can put a price tag on that. I do not think so. I don't know where everybody is, but if I've said anything about which you've got a question for me, you want to pray with me, you want to speak with me after the service,